Hey, what's up, everybody? Limitless episode 7 drops today, and it's a conversation with author and researcher Ralph Ellis. The ancient hardstone vase topic is one of the hottest topics on the internet right now, and that's because for the first time ever, these 5,000 plus year old artifacts are being thoroughly analyzed with modern technology. The precision and overall results of the red granite vases are incredible and impossible to achieve with primitive hand tools. As an example, the artifacts in this video all have consistent roundness that varies by less than the thickness of a sheet of paper. Skeptics of the results who insist that we know everything that there is to know about our past are left with no argument except to say that the artifacts are fake. The following conversation suggests otherwise, and it highlights for the first time that these artifacts were created using an ancient Egyptian form of measurement. It's extremely unlikely that a modern-day forger would be doing this. In addition, we may have stumbled upon a lost subunit for the finger for the first time, which is 1/6 of a finger. If these artifacts are truly ancient, as the mounting data is suggesting, that rewrites human history and it proves that our ancestors were capable of much more than academics give them credit for today. I hope you enjoy episode 7 of Limitless.
The way that we came in contact was I saw a post that you did on your Facebook page about the measurements of a couple of the vases. And so I read through that. You seemed like an intriguing person. I followed up on who you were. It turns out you've written several books, and you've been researching this for 45 years. You've been researching ancient mysteries and alternative theories for ancient history for 45 years now. So I thought you'd be an incredible person to talk to and get a little bit more information about. And so if you could just introduce yourself and we'll get right into it.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me on your show, Matt. It's good to be here. Yes, I've had a whole lifetime of looking at these subjects. So I started with there was a big interest in the pyramids and so on back in the 80s and especially the 90s, on the run up to the millennium. There was this sort of pyramid fever almost. So I was involved in that, had a lot of interest. And also a lot of interest in history, courtesy of my father. And that's why I was interested in your vase project or vase project, courtesy of everyone else that was involved in this project. So I must give a shout out to them. You've got Adam Young and Alex Dunn, of course, who have done a lot of the measurements. Yourself in purchasing some of these vases, which is very difficult because the museums and so on will not indulge in this, which is a bit of a shame. I've contacted the Petrie Museum. They didn't want to play ball, and neither did the Manchester Museum, wanting to scan their ancient vases, because part of the contention has been, as you know yourself, that maybe you haven't got real ancient ones because they don't have a history behind the purchases. And so they say, oh, well, maybe it's a modern fake. But I don't believe so, and we'll go through why that is so. I think these are genuinely ancient vases that you've managed to get hold of, and the metrology confirms that in my view.
Yeah, the provenance on many of them does go back to the 60s. It does go back to the 70s in many cases. For the most part, that's where I find the provenance being. But of course, most of them were discovered, as I understand, at the Step Pyramid of Dozier in the early part of the 20th century. And so having provenance go back much prior to that would be, impossible, essentially. But are any of them modern reproductions? It of course would have been the one that you're looking at in the middle on the right there. The spinner vase has provenance going back to 1968. It would have been difficult to have produced such an accurate vase. I like vase, actually. Call them a vase, or a vase is a little bit more sophisticated, so I like that. But it doesn't quite do them justice. They're such incredible artifacts. But Adams, the taller one there has provenance to the 1980s, and then the spinner vase has provenance back to 1968. And they are both extraordinarily precise artifacts. And so I have no doubt that the vast majority of the artifacts in my collection are authentic, but they don't all show this level of precision. And so, I am keeping an open mind to the possibility, albeit relatively small, I think, that these could be potentially modern reproductions. But you have some information that certainly would confirm what all of us really think is the more likely explanation, that these truly are significantly older, thousands of years old.
Yes, I'm pretty convinced these are ancient. And why would you want to put that amount of precision? And we're talking, we'll see in a minute, to the nearest few thou in inch terms. why would you want to put that amount of precision into an object of this nature? And then how can you put it into an object which is made of granite? These are made of, I'm not sure if this is Aswan granite, but anyway, granite is a very difficult rock to actually work with. And again, if people want to know more about it, watch the videos by Ben and Alex Dunn and so on, talking about how you would try to reproduce these in the modern world with modern machinery. It's very difficult. And then to be able to think of someone making these by hand without machinery, well, that stretches credulity somewhat.
It's impossible. It's just, that has to be impossible.
Yeah, I would say it's impossible. But I think the metrology sort of confirms that these must be ancient and probably machine made. And what I was doing, because a lot of what Alex Dunn and Adam Young were doing was on the conformity of the vases, that they were very symmetrical. And we'll see one image of that in a minute, that you would hardly manage to be able to do by hand. It's the sort of thing you could only achieve by turning. And then you've got the problem of trying to turn an object between the handles, which makes it 10 times as difficult, because you can't turn in those points.
Right.
But the metrology comes out with something very interesting. Now, the first one I came across was this one. I call it Vase 1. Because all the work I've been doing on the pyramids, I've been working on Egyptian metrology. So they use the cubit and the hand length and the finger length. So for the royal cubit, there are 7 hands in a cubit, and there are 4 fingers in a hand. So you've got 28 fingers in a cubit. And this is the royal cubit. This goes back a long way, and this sort of dovetails in with some of my historical biblical work, because this was the same cubit that the Israelites used. So this was a very common unit of measure. And this comes from Ezekiel 43:12. And it says, this is the law of the temple. Upon the top of the mountain, the whole limit thereof roundabout shall be most holy. We'll go into this a little bit. I don't want to sidetrack too much, but when they're talking about mountains, I always have this idea that they're talking about Giza. But anyway, there was a temple on a mountain, according to Ezekiel. And he says, these are the measures of the altar after the cubits. So there was an altar on the top of the temple, on the top of this mountain. And he says the cubit is a cubit and a hand breadth. Now, that is the royal cubit, because the cubit was 6 hands long. The royal cubit was 7. So it was a cubit and a hand breadth. And that's exactly the same cubit length that Ezekiel was using. And we know that as the royal cubit, sometimes called the Thoth cubit. And then you can divide that down to get a finger length, which in metric is 18.71 millimeters. So it's just under an inch is the finger length.
1.87 centimeters. And Ralph, is any of this disputed, or is this generally all accepted and agreed upon?
No, the royal cubit is well known. Now, this has been known ever since the 18th century. The first person to discover the royal cubit was Sir Isaac Newton. So we have a good pedigree for this unit of measure. He sent, because he didn't actually go to Egypt, but Egypt was open at this time in the 18th century, and he sent John Greaves down there, who did measurements of the Great Pyramid. Now, he couldn't measure the external dimensions, which was unfortunate because it was covered in sand, but he did go into the king's chamber and measure all of the chambers there. And Sir Isaac Newton discovered that the chamber is a 10 by 20 cubit chamber. And that cubit is the royal cubit of 52.4 centimeters.
Exactly 10 by 20.
Yeah, it's a double square. The same as all Masonic lodges are supposed to be double squares as well. So yes, it's 10 by 20 exactly in royal cubits. So that's been known for a long time, and that's been confirmed in all of the other measurements that we get on the other pyramids, the the Giza pyramids and the Dashur pyramids. So that's quite a well-known unit of measure. And we'll look at that in a minute because it has great similarity with the measurement system that we're using at present. Well, America is anyway, the imperial system. It's very much the same. So yeah, as I said, when we divide that down into finger lengths, we suddenly find that this vessel that we're looking at, which I call vase 1, has an opening which is 2 royal fingers. And that's that's very accurate. You can see down in the middle here, I think you can see my cursor going around. The error is 0.07 millimeters.
Wow.
Or 3 thou.
Wow.
In inch terms. So yes, that opening is very accurately 2 finger lengths. And I don't think that could be achieved by accident. And we'll see why, because all of the other vases have very similar correspondence to the finger system.
And now, your point is it should be obvious to everyone, but your point is that there is no way that any forger or anyone who would attempt to manufacture this artifact in modern times to sell it on the black market would have any idea about the royal finger and attempt to put those measurements within this artifact.
Yeah, very few people know about the finger system, and a forger, in my view, wouldn't even bother with it because that's not in their purview. All they want to do is create an artifact, put it on the shelf, and sell it to a tourist.
Right.
And A, they wouldn't want something that was super accurate like this is, and B, they wouldn't really care about what size it was. As long as it looks pretty, as long as it's nice and shiny, lots of bling to go with it, it'll sell to a tourist, and that's what they're looking for. So that brought me on to the second, vase 2, which I call it. Which is similar to vase 1. It's got a smaller lip on the top, but nevertheless, it's quite similar. Again, it's made out of granite. This is just this is the scan view from the scan project, obviously. This is a scan of it. Using the royal finger, again, of 18.714, if you want to be accurate, cubits, millimeters. And we'll see why that's an accurate measure in a minute. That's taking the cubit length as being 524 millimeters. And we'll see why that's an accurate measure. That's the measure that Sir Isaac Newton got, actually. He got between 523 and 524 millimeters. So he got quite an accurate cubit length when he did this measurement back in the 18th century. So the height and the breadth are not that accurate, I suppose you might say. So we've got 5.47 fingers, which I think is obviously therefore 5.5, and that's accurate to 0.5 millimeter. And we've got the height, which is 6.7. Now that sounds like an odd figure, but I think that's 6 2/3 of a finger. We'll see why in a minute, which is 0.6 of a millimeter out. So not that precise, but not all of these vases are the same. They are different. But if we look at the top, we see why this is a very unusual measurement, which no forger would really be wanting to look at. So this is looking down on the top of this vase, and we get some very odd units, which initially, if you just look at this, you might think, well, this is random. We get 3.16, 3.35, and 3.67 for the outer diameter, the inner diameter, and then the throat diameter underneath. And they look fairly random, those figures. But if we do it in fractions, because of course the Egyptians used fractions, they didn't use decimal, we get an idea of what they were using. And this is what we get in fractions, which is 3 1/6, 3 2/6, and 3 4/6 of a finger unit, which is interesting because nobody has really identified previously what the subunits to a finger were. Obviously, if you're doing machining of artifacts to a very small level, you do need subunits of the finger system. And now we can see that they were using sixths, which is a reasonable fraction to use. And these come out to fairly good tolerances. So the error on this in thou, so we've got 13 thou, 7 thou, and 4 thou. away from the perfect 3 1/6, 3 2/6, 3 4/6. So it's pretty accurate, the top of this particular vase.
It sure is. Yeah, it's very close. And I think that when you're talking about 1/10 of a millimeter, you could be talking about how the actual scan data was kind of looked at. And
yeah, this is from the scan data, is where I got this data from.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's accurate, because otherwise it wouldn't have come out to these units,
Right.
If it was random measures, or if the instrumentation was incorrect, you would get more random figures. But this is clearly using fingers and sixths of a fingers to a very high tolerance. And again, no forger would be doing this. There's absolutely no reason for them to do this.
Right.
So again, this indicates that this is an ancient vase, and it was made, like all of these vases, to an incredible degree of accuracy for no good reason.
Right.
And how on earth was it done without machinery?
Mm-hmm.
I think you would have to invoke some fairly high-tech machinery to make this. And then we come on to the spinner. This is called, I think it's a good term actually, the spinner vase. It's called the spinner because it doesn't have a base, and it balances quite happily on a point, which is quite amazing in itself, that it will balance. And again, this is the scan data for the spinner vase 1, because there's 2 of these.
Mm-hmm.
And this is pretty accurate. So the width, if we look at the width here, 5.99. Well, quite obviously, I think they were looking for 6, and that gives an error of -5 thou.
But just handling the stone over 5,000 years could cause a reduction of of that amount of material being lost from the surface of the artifact.
If it's being used on a daily basis, yes, quite easily.
Mm-hmm.
What was the human hair? Was it about 25 thou or so? I can't remember quite what a
human hair is about 3 to 4 thousandths, I believe.
Okay, that's small. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because it's about 200 microns or something, isn't it? So that's 25 microns to the thou. Yeah, so that's to a very high tolerance. But the top, we get 3.49, which I think will be 3.5, and 2.33, which I think is 2 1/3. Or in 6, okay, I've done it in fractions here to a half. So 3.5 or 2 1/3. Or if we're doing this in sixths, it'll be 3 3/6 and 2 2/6. So I think, again, they're working in sixths of a finger. And it's interesting because we then find, of course, looking at these figures, that the inner diameter is 2/3 of the outer diameter, exactly. So they've been made, obviously, to a specific measurement. So we get 2/3 and then 3/3 in the measurements. And because the measurement is 3.49, 3.5, the circumference of this will be 11. So it'll be an even number for the circumference of the top of the vase on this one. And these, again, are fairly accurate. We've got it to -7 thou and -6 thou on the dimensions on the opening there.
Which is the width of a sheet of paper, the height of a sheet of paper.
It is, yeah.
Yeah.
It's pretty good. You'd never do that by hand. It's just not possible. And to keep it, because I'm just looking at the measurements, but obviously your scan project was looking at the what you might call the roundness of it. So the continuity of that around the diameter, around the opening. So it's very, very accurate all the way around, not just in one diameter, but all the way around. Very, very expertly done. But just looking at the opening here in fingers, if we convert that into cubits, we get 1/8 of a cubit and 1/12 of a cubit.
Wow.
Very precisely.
Yep.
Now, those are not real units that we know of that they actually use. They didn't use 1/8ths and 1/12ths of a cubit, but nevertheless, that's exactly what they come out as.
And if there was some smaller group of numbers, if there was cubits and then fingers and then something smaller that existed in terms of a form of measurement in the equation, would we know about it?
Well, I've not seen it mentioned, and I've looked into the history of this for quite some time. We'll look at a ruler in a minute, an Egyptian ruler. and none of them are marked with this subunit of the finger.
Okay.
And well, we could look at that now while we're sort of on the subject. Here's an Egyptian ruler. So
Wow.
this is what they were using, but and all of these are fingers. All of these big units are fingers, but they've been divided up into different units, which is really confusing. So the first one is divided into 2, then 3, then 4, then 5, then 6, then 7, then 8. So what subunits were they using? We don't really know.
All of them, I
and what
guess.
they appear to be using is this 1/6, which is this one here, divided into 6 subunits. Yeah, very strange.
Very interesting. Yeah. So for this artifact, they were using the 1/6, but potentially for other artifacts, they were, for other things, potentially they're using other, other ratios.
Yeah, which is an interesting way of doing it. I mean, we wouldn't do that nowadays, but that's apparently what they did.
Right.
But I've not seen these subunits mentioned very much in the historical record. So this is all quite new that, here are artifacts which are all using the 1/6 subunit. Then we come on to, this is spinner 2.
Right.
And this one, apparently, according to the scan data, is very conformal all the way around its diameter. So there are no high patches and low patches. These are obviously the high and lows, but these are measuring to the nearest thou on these highs and lows. I mean, they're not really highs and lows at all.
Right. Yeah, this one is even more accurate than the OG, the Adams vase, or the thin-walled vase, or spinner vase number 1. This spinner vase number 2, at least on the initial scan report, and it's only one report that I've gotten back on this thing so far, but it's averaged 0.02 of an inch, whereas the others were closer to 4, 5, 6. So yeah, it's this one's remarkable for sure.
And if anyone has doing motor maintenance, we don't do motor maintenance anymore, so people don't know what I'm talking about probably in the new generation. In the old days, every 5,000 miles or so, or even less, you had to unscrew your spark plugs and reset the gap on your spark plugs using a feeler gauge, which was measured in thou. Now, generally, we were measuring something like 20 thou for a spark plug gap, but on the same gauge, you would have a 2 thou feeler for other purposes, mainly for doing the timing on the engine. That 2 thou feeler is so delicate you can break it. It's not like paper. It's like I don't know, tissue paper or something. It's really, really thin, and you have to be careful not to break it, even though it's made of metal. That's how thin 2 thou is. You can barely actually feel it in your fingers.
Yeah.
Astounding level of machining on this artifact.
Yeah.
Now, interestingly, on the measurements, I make it less accurate than the other one.
Yeah.
Now, this might be because you only gave me the caliper readings on this, so I didn't get the scan data on this one. It didn't have the measurements on it. But quite obviously, this is a copy of the other pot. It's exactly the same. So again, the opening is 2 2/6, and the rim diameter is 3 3/6, 3.5. Wow. 6 fingers for the diameter, exactly the same as the other vase. So they're identical almost, these two. It's just that the errors are slightly larger on this. So we've got 33 thou, 31 thou, and 10 thou. But that just might be the measurements I've got, so we could maybe update this and see if we can get some more accurate figures on this.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I'll get scan data for this one eventually. But to be, less than 1/10 of a millimeter away from a perfect,
it's still good, isn't it?
It's incredible. It's absolutely
we're being
incredible.
very picky here, aren't we?
Yeah. That's amazing.
Yeah.
And I should mention the shape of this one. While the height is very similar and the width is, I guess, exactly the same as the original spinner. The dimensions are slightly different. This one does sit on a wider bottom. It's not quite as much of a point. The handles are a bit lower. The handles are angled differently. And I should mention that the handles themselves are, I believe in almost all of these vases that the handles are intentionally offset from each other and not directly across from each other on these things. And in order to understand why they created them like that, you would, of course, have to understand the function. But it's very consistent that the handles are not not directly across from each other. They're intentionally closer together on one side of the artifact than they are the other. And what that does is it makes the scan data appear to be inaccurate, because the scan is attempting to find is attempting to measure what perfection would look like if they were directly across from each other. But that, I don't believe, was the intent on these things.
And that's interesting, because it puts into question the actual function of these vases as well, because
Right.
What are the handles for?
Right. Why would they need to be?
If you were going to use them for lifting the item, you would want them symmetric so it doesn't tip over.
Right.
Because these will, if they had fluid in them or whatever, it will be asymmetric, and therefore it'll start to tip over.
Right.
So what is the function of these handles?
Right.
They almost focus. You can see it in this diagram here, where they focus in on a point.
Right.
Because they're not parallel, they're slightly inclined, so they will focus in on a point. So almost you could, if you put two sticks through them, they would end up touching each other eventually at some point. So yeah, that's a very odd feature, really, isn't it? And just why the precision on a mundane artifact. Now, we might do this if it was simple. So, if you look at vessels that were made, 200 years ago, they wouldn't be as accurate as ones we're making now, just because it is more and more simple for us to do it nowadays. And therefore our accuracy is increased and increased and increased. Same with sort of motor manufacture or something, making pistons. The accuracy has increased, not necessarily because you need to, but just that the machinery we have are very capable of doing much more accurate work. So I would say the accuracy we see on these vessels is because it was simple for them. And therefore, what you're going to produce is always going to be very accurate, because the machinery is set up for making accurate items. How that is achieved, of course, is another matter, because we don't have any information on what sort of machines they might have been using. But you could not make this with, say, a wooden lathe. It just would not be stiff enough. It would not be accurate enough. It would not be steady enough. It would have to be a metal machine. And of course, that is tricky, because this is in the pre-Iron Age. At the very most, we're talking about the Copper Age or the Bronze Age, and you'd have to be making machinery out of bronze. All very difficult. And of course, we don't have any of that machinery. So we're all looking at guesswork at present.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. And you should mention that the lathe, the mainstream explanation for how these were manufactured does not involve a lathe, not even a wooden lathe, not even a very primitive lathe. The mainstream explanation is that these were created by pounding on them with rocks and smoothing them out with stones and putting a stick inside of it with a copper tip on it to hollow it out, and just rubbing it with sand to make it smooth. I mean, that's the mainstream explanation for how something that is to within 0.02 of an inch of perfect symmetry was created, just completely by hand.
And a perfect size, not just perfect symmetry.
Right.
To a specific size, that's much more difficult. I've seen them doing this in Egypt, and they still make them by hand. Not so much in the granite, it's mainly in alabaster, which is much easier to do. And they do it with a couple of iron rods, and they grind it round on the inside. But of course, with alabaster, that's much easier. But what they actually produce, although it might be nice and shiny by the time they've polished it up, is not accurate to any degree at all.
Right.
And it's certainly not accurate to any particular measurement system.
You can't do this by hand. Yeah.
No, it's a nice shiny item to sell to a tourist, and that's it.
Right.
And yes, you cannot get this sort of accuracy with it.
Right.
Because it's such a difficult medium to use. And then we've got the problem of the handles again, because that, as I say, makes it 10 times harder, because now you cannot do that on a lathe to make the handles. You've got to make a torus around the pot, which will become the handles, and then take out the material in between. And so in machine terms, you can't even do this on a lathe. You need a 5-axis sort of milling machine in order to be able to do it, because it then has to go up and down to make the handles, as well as go round and round. So it's all very tricky.
Yep.
And just looking at it on this image from the scan, if I zoom in a little bit, you can't really see any difference between what might have been lathed and what would have to have been milled out by other means to make the handles.
No.
It's you can't see the difference. And let's go to the this one. Okay. Now the bit in between the handles you cannot do on a lathe.
Right.
So how on earth do you get it to that accuracy? Remember, the difference between the blue and the green you're saying is about 2 thou.
Right. Right. Yeah,
and yet that section between the handles has to be done on a different machine to the rest of the pot.
Mm-hmm. It's mind-boggling. It's absolutely mind-boggling.
You can perhaps see there has been a different machining process because you get a slightly high spot here and a slightly high spot below, and the bit in between is slightly different. But we're only talking 2 thou. Mm-hmm. We're not talking major excursions in order to make these handles correct.
Right.
It's unbelievable.
It really is.
It would be interesting to see if anyone could make
Mm-hmm.
this with modern machinery and see what they come up with.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Well, that is very very thought-provoking. Any other thoughts on the vases before we move on?
No, just one little extra. This is my spreadsheet I made of. I'm not sure if people can see the figures there, but people can come back and have a look at it maybe. Of the 4 different vases that we've looked at. Mm-hmm. The main thing I was going to point out is the purple in the middle here is the dimensions in fingers, and they're all in sixths, of course, all the way down. Here's the errors in millimeter. Here's the errors in thous, and they're all fairly low, of course.
Unbelievable.
And the other, yeah, it's quite unbelievable. The other interesting thing was my finger length correct? Because I've just taken the finger length effectively from Sir Isaac Newton and from the other measurements we've done on the pyramid, which obviously is a very big artifact. and they came out with 524 millimeters, which comes down to a finger length of 18.714. Sorry. That was the finger length I was using. So what I did is I took all of the errors, and here I devised a finger length to make the artifact perfect. So obviously, if it's a bit bigger or a bit smaller, what finger length would we need to make this a perfect 6 fingers or 4 fingers or whatever it was supposed to be? So these are the amended finger lengths to make the dimensions perfect. And if you add them all up, the average is 18.71, which is almost exactly what I started with. Mm-hmm. So all the pluses and minuses on these various vases, all of the different errors cancel out, basically, and we end up with the same finger length. So I think that's a fairly good estimate of what the finger length would have been, 18.71, because that's what we end up with at the bottom, 18.71.
And again, that's millimeters.
Yeah, that's in millimeters.
Yeah. Unbelievable. Yeah. Really, really incredible work here, Ralph. This is amazing stuff. It's absolutely fascinating and mind-blowing, and it really pushes the work forward in a major way. I mean, this hasn't been looking at these artifacts in terms of the royal finger and just ancient systems of ancient numerical Egyptian systems has not been something that has been done as a part of this project to date. So I really applaud you for recognizing this and seeing this and taking the initiative to do the measurements and to it really does add a ton of credibility to the side of this discussion of, hey, these are authentic artifacts. These are real artifacts. They really are significantly ancient. And I think that, with the mounting evidence that we're seeing for these things being real and truly actually being out of place artifacts, it's beginning to become overwhelming now. And your work is certainly is going to add a lot to that. So I appreciate it. I appreciate the work that you've done on these and look forward to further discussions. And I just want to say thank you.
Yeah, and thanks for having me on the show. And I hope it generates and stimulates some discussion on this, because, the more minds we get on this, the better. Because I'm sure other people will see, other aspects of this that we've missed.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, thanks very much for it.